Over the next few videos, we're going to talk to you a bit about shadows. Now, before we get into the various properties of shadows and setting them up on your lights, there are some things, just some basic information about shadows you need to know.
Right. The shadows we're going to be talking about are real-time shadows.
And by that, you mean what exactly?
Well, they're shadows that are calculated at runtime while you're actually playing your game.
Right, so if you have a moving light or objects in your scene that are moving around, those can actually cast shadows that move around as well.
Well, it's a little bit more than that. With a real-time shadow, everything in your scene is actually going to cast shadows if you've turned it on to cast shadows, whether or not it's moving or it's standing still. The real-time part of it means that when you're actually running the game, a light that has been set to cast shadows is going to cast shadows.
Okay. Now, can everybody using Unity have access to these real-time shadows?
No. There are certain limitations that come with it. Real-time shadows is a pro-only feature. Now, there's another limitation which is based on what rendering path you're using.
Now, rendering path was something we discussed earlier on, well, depending on the order in which you watch these videos, we did discuss in the camera section.
Right.
And we also discussed it in the project settings.
Exactly. When we were discussing the player settings specifically, we showed you where you could choose your default rendering path that you were going to use while playing your game. We also discussed in the camera how that default setting can be overridden with the camera that you're using to play your game.
And here we can see that inside the camera we have rendering path currently set to use player settings, or we can set this to our three different modes being vertex lit, forward, and deferred lighting. Now, what do these three modes have to do with shadows as far as we're concerned?
Well, there are limitations depending on what you're using as your rendering path. The things that you need to know, not all rendering paths are available in all different versions of Unity. Case in point, deferred lighting is a pro-only feature.
Okay.
So if you have the standard version, you cannot use deferred lighting. It goes a little bit further in that depending on the platform that you're building out for, you may or may not be able to use all of these rendering modes. If you're building out for an older mobile device, you may only be limited to the vertex lit rendering path. If you're using the newer iPhone or Android, you could use forward, but you can't use deferred. There's actually a chart on the Unity website that you can reference that'll show you what platforms you can use the different rendering paths. As I was mentioning, deferred lighting is a pro-only feature, but it comes with the nice advantage that if you're using deferred lighting and you can use it, you can set up real-time shadows on all three of our light types. We can set it up on a directional, we can set it up on point and spotlight. You can also have multiple shadows for different lights. This is something that you can't have if you're using forward lighting. If you're using the forward rendering path, you can only have one real-time shadow, and it can only be applied to a directional light.
So just to clarify, if we're using the forward rendering path, a spotlight can't cast shadows, and neither can a point light.
Correct.
It's only one directional light.
Exactly.
Which is useful enough. I mean, if you have a relatively, I mean, it doesn't even have to, I won't call it a simple game, but if you just need that one basic sunlight, that's still useful. But you won't get all of the nice, pretty lighting and shadow effects that would be afforded to you from deferred lighting.
Right. And even if you do have deferred lighting, you have to take into consideration the performance of the game.
Yeah.
Just because you can set up real-time shadows on your lights, all three of them, you don't want to put 100 lights in your scene all casting real-time shadows. You're going to bring your game to a crawl.
And that's something else I did want to make sure we brought up in this section, is that while real-time shadows are certainly pretty and they can add a tremendous dramatic effect to your levels, be really careful about deciding when and where to use them. And in general, try to use as few as you can possibly get away with.
Right. And if you can get away with not using them, that's even better. But if you want to use them, scatter them around, judiciously in your level, so they are used to the greatest advantage.
Right. And something we will be discussing a little bit later here in the lighting section is light mapping, which is where we can take the lighting and shadow information that we set up using all of our various lights and bake that into a texture which gets applied across our level, so that we don't have to worry about calculating these real-time shadows, which are fairly expensive.
Right. It's basically a way that we can pre-calculate where our lights and shadows are going to be, and we can use that for static objects.
Right, and we'll get deeper into that a little bit later on in the lighting section. So for now, that's those are the key aspects I wanted to make sure we got across before we started talking about shadows. Is that one, real-time shadows, the shadows we're going to be discussing here, are a pro-only feature. That they won't work for every single light using all of the different rendering paths. If you want to be able to cast shadows with point lights and spotlights, you need to be using deferred lighting, which again is a pro-only feature and not supported by every single platform.
Exactly.
The forward rendering path is going to allow for a single real-time shadow coming from a directional light, and that is it. And Vertex Light just doesn't do real-time shadows at all.
Right.
So with all of that, I think we're ready to jump in and start taking a look at the various settings for real-time shadows on our lights. That will wrap things up for this video. Thanks for watching.